It is 10:15 in the morning on March 3rd, 1943, situated in the Bismarck Sea, 30 nautical miles northwest of Lae, New Guinea. Amidst the churning waves, a Japanese naval officer clings with a trembling, oil-blackened hand to the splintered wreckage of what was once the destroyer Arashio. Through eyes stinging from salt water and fuel, he watches as American B-25 Mitchell bombers circle like vultures over a debris field that stretches for miles. A grim panorama of burning wreckage and thousands of men desperately clinging to flotsam, marking the catastrophic end of a convoy that had departed Rabaul with supreme confidence just 2 days prior. Only days earlier, on February 28th, nearly 7,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division had boarded 8 transport ships at Simpson Harbor in Rabaul, convinced they were en route to reinforce Lae and turn the tide of the war in New Guinea. Instead, they were sailing into a slaughter that would shatter every conception of warfare they had been taught, dismantling their ideals of honor and every assumption about American military capability that their propaganda had instilled in them. This desperate operation had been set in motion in late December 1942 by Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, as Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura sought to salvage the deteriorating strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific. The resulting convoy was a massive undertaking, comprising 8 destroyers, escorting 8 transport vessels, carrying the elite main body of the 51st Division, transferred from China, protected by an aerial escort of approximately 100 fighters. Commanding this fleet from the destroyer Shirayuki was Rear Admiral Masatami Kimura, a veteran of numerous successful operations, who understood the grave risks involved. His caution was well-founded, as 18th Army Staff War Games had predicted a mere 50-50 chance of success, forecasting the potential loss of up to 4 transports and nearly 40 aircraft before the mission even began. As the convoy rounded the northern coast of New Britain on March 1st, they were spotted by a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group, but the Japanese were unaware that their movements had already been anticipated by Allied intelligence. Naval codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington had successfully decrypted messages revealing the convoy's destination and timeline, allowing General George Kenney at 5th Air Force Headquarters to unleash a revolutionary tactic. His air crews had spent months perfecting skip bombing, a technique refined by Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn that involved modifying B-25 Mitchells with heavy forward-firing machine guns to skip bombs across the water's surface like stones, striking ships directly in their hulls. Although dawn broke gray and overcast on March 2nd, the clouds parted by 1,000 hours to reveal 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses at high altitude, initiating the first phase of the destruction. The transport, Kyoko Maru, laden with 1,500 troops and aviation fuel, was struck and exploded in a massive fireball, prompting the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze to break formation to rescue survivors, an act of humanity that tactically doomed the convoy by forcing it to slow down. The following morning of March 3rd brought clear skies and perfect flying weather, and as the diminished fleet closed to within 2/3 of the distance to Lae, the final trap was sprung. At 1,000 hours on March 3rd, death arrived from multiple directions in a coordinated onslaught that effectively decided the outcome of the campaign in the span of 15 minutes. High-altitude B-17 bombers drew Japanese fighter defenses and anti-aircraft fire skyward, leaving the ships vulnerable to 13 Australian Beaufighters that swept in at mast height to rake the decks with cannon fire. Immediately following them were the modified B-25s, flying so low their propellers kicked up spray from the ocean, utilizing the skip bombing technique to slam explosives directly into the sides of the frantic vessels. Captain Ed Larner, leading the 90th Squadron, approached the transport Teo Maru at wavetop height, silencing her defenses with his forward guns before releasing bombs that skipped twice across the water and detonated against the hull. The nearly 7,000-ton transport snapped in half and sank within minutes, and by 10:15, just a quarter hour after the attack commenced, all 7 remaining transports had been hit and were sinking. Admiral Kimura's flagship, the Shirayuki, took a direct hit that detonated her forward magazine, disappearing in a violent explosion as the Bismarck Sea was transformed into a horrific hellscape of fire and ruin. The ocean's surface was a nightmare landscape of burning oil and thick bunker fuel, littered with wreckage and humanity. Conservative estimates suggest that over 3,000 men were left struggling in the water, exhausted sailors, wounded soldiers clinging to debris, and those unable to swim. 4 surviving destroyers, the Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikinami, immediately commenced rescue operations, managing to pull approximately 2,700 survivors from the sea and transport them to Rabaul. But their efforts were strictly limited by the looming threat of an Allied aerial return. Around 1400 hours on March 3rd, American aircraft reappeared, and the initial relief felt by the survivors quickly turned to absolute horror. While many hoping for rescue assumed the planes were merely documenting the destruction, the aircraft descended to wave height and opened fire, shattering any expectation of mercy. In a move that remains controversial to this day, Allied forces spent the following days patrolling these waters, ruthlessly strafing lifeboats and swimmers in a calculated effort to prevent the enemy from coming ashore. From the American perspective, the tactical justification was clear. These were enemy combatants who, if allowed to reach land, would immediately reinforce the Japanese garrison at Leh. B-25s, A-20 Havocs, and Beaufighters made repeated low-level passes, their machine guns churning the water into a bloody foam to ensure total interdiction. General Kenney's orders were explicit and uncompromising, mandating that no Japanese soldier was to reach New Guinea alive, a directive that stood in stark contrast to the enemy's expectations. For the Japanese soldiers struggling in the water, these actions violated every fundamental concept of honorable warfare they held dear. The Bushido Code explicitly dictated that defeated enemies should be treated with dignity. But the reality of the Bismarck Sea shattered those cultural assumptions completely. Instead of chivalry, they faced a mechanized slaughter that offered no quarter to the defenseless. As darkness fell on March 3rd, the terror continued with the arrival of 10 U.S. Navy PT boats under the command of Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins. Throughout the night, these vessels systematically hunted down survivors, sweeping the water with searchlights before opening up with machine gun fire. During this nocturnal purge, PT-143 and PT-150 located the damaged transport Oigawa Maru, which was still afloat, and torpedoed it, casting even more men into the perilous waters. The night brought horrors beyond human weaponry, as the blood and distressed movements in the water attracted sharks. Men who had already survived the sinking of their ships and the aerial strafing now found themselves facing a gruesome death from below. The psychological toll was immense, as survivors were forced to endure the darkness while listening to the screams of their comrades being taken by predators. Dawn on March 4th revealed a debris field stretching for 40 miles, dotted with small groups of survivors who had been treading water for over 20 hours. When American aircraft returned with the sunrise, they targeted the destroyer Asashio, which had lingered behind to rescue men from the Arashio. The vessel was struck by a 500-pound bomb, roughly 230 kilograms, and sank rapidly, taking the very soldiers she had just rescued down with her. The American justification for this relentless strafing was rooted in both tactical necessity and a deep-seated desire for revenge. As recorded by James Duffy in War at the End of the World, American pilots were enraged after witnessing a B-17, the Double Trouble piloted by Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore, collide with a Zero. When 7 crew members parachuted out, they were gunned down by Japanese fighters as they floated helplessly. This incident, observed by other bomber crews, hardened their resolve, leading General Kenney to euphemistically describe the subsequent slaughter as mopping up operations. For several days, Allied airmen prowled the seas, executing General Kenney's orders to strafe lifeboats and rafts, a process detailed in a secret report from March 20th, 1943. The document noted that the slaughter continued until nightfall, ensuring that any survivors who escaped the aircraft were left at least 30 miles from land in shark-infested waters. Despite the danger, the Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 attempted stealthy rescue operations on March 6th and 8th, managing to save around 224 men, though they were forced to leave hundreds more behind due to limited capacity. The statistics of the engagement were nothing short of staggering. Out of 6,900 troops desperately needed in New Guinea, only about 1,200 reached Lae, while approximately 2,700 were returned to Rabaul by destroyers and submarines. Roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors perished. In stark contrast, Allied losses were minimal, totaling just 4 aircraft and 13 airmen, a casualty ratio of 230 to 1, which was unprecedented in naval warfare. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a decisive turning point. Following these catastrophic losses, Japan never again attempted to send a large surface convoy to reinforce garrisons within range of Allied aircraft. Captain Tamechi Hara of the destroyer Shigure, who later interviewed participants, described the event as a complete debacle, the absolute antithesis of the successful withdrawal from Guadalcanal. The battle not only inflicted psychological devastation, but also showcased revolutionary aerial techniques, proving that skip bombing, combined with heavy strafing, had effectively transformed medium bombers into lethal ship killers. Following the events of December 1941, Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron, operating under the 5th Air Force, successfully deployed skip bombing tactics against Imperial Navy warships and transports in the Southwest Pacific. Simultaneously, Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn of the 90th Bond Squadron transformed the B-25 and A-20 airframes into true flying battleships, bristling with 8 to 14 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. These extensive modifications allowed pilots to shred anti-aircraft defenses during their approach, before delivering ordnance at point-blank range, fundamentally altering the lethality of aerial maritime warfare. While the destruction of the convoy was absolute, not every survivor perished immediately in the sea. Small, desperate bands managed to navigate to nearby islands, only to face a grim fate upon arrival. One group of 18 survivors made landfall on Kirawina, where they were promptly captured by the crew of PT-114, while others, who navigated their rafts to Guadalcanal, were intercepted and killed by American patrols. On Goodenough Island, the situation was equally dire, as Australian forces actively hunted down the remnants of the Japanese troops washing up on their shores. The scale of the mop-up operations on Goodenough Island provides a chilling snapshot of the aftermath, particularly during the week of March 8th to 14th, 1943. Australian patrols from the 47th Infantry Battalion located and engaged the stranded soldiers, killing 72 and taking 42 prisoner, while discovering another 9 who had already died on their raft. These engagements highlighted the total collapse of the convoy's mission, a failure the Japanese High Command would not fully comprehend until hostilities had ceased. Unbeknownst to the Japanese commanders, their convoy had been sailing into a trap from the very moment it weighed anchor, doomed by a catastrophic intelligence breach. Allied cryptographic units in Melbourne and Washington, D.C. had successfully decrypted and translated intercepted messages, revealing the convoy's precise composition, route, and arrival times. While the Japanese Imperial Navy remained convinced of their code's inviolability, the Allies possessed every detail necessary to orchestrate a perfect ambush. For a Japanese military culture deeply rooted in the traditions of Bushido, the massacre at the Bismarck Sea precipitated a profound existential crisis. The warrior code prioritized honor in battle and dignity in defeat, but the industrial slaughter of helpless men drifting in the ocean violated every martial principle they held dear. Those who eventually returned to Rabaul were irrevocably changed, having witnessed a level of American ruthlessness that completely shattered the wartime propaganda depicting the enemy as weak or spiritless. The harrowing image of aircraft systematically hunting survivors in the water haunted the Japanese forces, instilling a deep psychological terror that rippled throughout the Pacific theater. Many veterans of the battle reported a total loss of faith in ultimate victory, reasoning that if the Americans were capable of machine-gunning shipwrecked sailors, there was no limit to their potential violence. This realization hardened their resolve to fight to the death, as surrender was now equated with certain execution. The morality of strafing survivors remains a subject of intense historical and legal debate, sitting uneasily within the frameworks of international law. While established conventions dictate that helpless shipwreck victims must be protected, the legal status of enemy combatants who have not formally surrendered remains ambiguous. Furthermore, the context of the Pacific War included well-documented Japanese atrocities, such as the rape of Nanking and the machine gunning of American air crews. Yet the Bismarck Sea represented a different kind of violence, one driven by cold, tactical efficiency rather than sadism. American veterans steadfastly defended the operation as a grim military necessity, arguing that the men in the water were not prisoners of war, but active enemy soldiers en route to reinforce the garrison at Leh. With the shore lying only 10 to 15 miles away, there was a high probability that these troops could reach land and re-enter the fight. Consequently, the decision to eliminate them was viewed not as an act of cruelty, but as a preventative measure to save Allied lives in the bloody campaigns ahead. The catastrophe forced a complete strategic overhaul for the Japanese leadership, particularly for Admiral Minechi Koga, who took command after Yamamoto's death. Koga was forced to acknowledge that surface vessels could no longer survive in waters where the enemy held air superiority, leading to the effective abandonment of New Guinea as indefensible. The psychological shockwave was so severe that units scheduled for future transport missions began to experience unprecedented rates of desertion, with the fear of death at sea outweighing the terrors of combat on land. Conversely, for the American military, the engagement served as definitive proof that air power alone was capable of obliterating a naval force without the assistance of a surface fleet. It demonstrated that land-based aircraft, when properly equipped and guided by accurate intelligence, could dominate sea lanes, a lesson that would dictate Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. The victory validated the doctrine of air superiority and paved the way for the island-hopping campaigns that followed. In the post-war era, the question of whether the strafing constituted a war crime was quietly deliberated, but never brought to a formal tribunal. The official American stance maintained that the targets were combatants capable of continuing the fight, and the lack of prosecution, while Japanese officers were executed for similar actions, is often cited as a clear example of victor's justice. Both sides had transgressed moral boundaries in the brutal theater of the Pacific, yet judgment was reserved exclusively for the defeated. Historians view the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a watershed moment that signaled a terrifying transformation in the nature of aerial warfare. The statistics paint a picture of total annihilation. All 8 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers lost, and approximately 3,000 Japanese troops killed. compared to the loss of only 13 Allied airmen. Beyond the lopsided numbers, the battle epitomized the shift toward a war of attrition, where technology and intelligence combined to produce casualty ratios that amounted to massacre. General Douglas MacArthur described the event as the decisive aerial engagement of the Southwest Pacific, an assessment that history has proven accurate. Japan never regained the strategic initiative in the region, as the battle revealed that modern conflict had evolved beyond traditional engagements between armed fleets. The coordination of air power and signals intelligence had turned warfare into an exercise in extermination, signaling the beginning of the end for Japanese ambitions in New Guinea. For the United States, this victory marked the completion of a psychological and military transformation, from the shocked victims of Pearl Harbor to the practitioners of a ruthless industrialized efficiency. The nation that had been caught off guard was now capable of methodically dismantling enemy forces by the thousands. Ultimately, the controversy over the Bismarck Sea reflects the inherent moral complexity of war, where humanitarian law and military necessity collided in the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. Combatants on both sides quickly realized that the boundaries of traditional warfare would be obliterated in the context of a total conflict. This grim reality is perhaps best illustrated by the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which stands as one of the Second World War's most pivotal yet debated confrontations. Over the course of 3 days, the combined air forces of the United States and Australia annihilated a Japanese convoy, resulting in thousands of casualties and effectively severing any maritime supply lines to New Guinea. For the Japanese personnel who survived the sinking ships, the horror was just beginning, as they witnessed American aircraft strafing defenseless men floating in the water. This experience inflicted indelible psychological trauma, forcing them to confront an adversary far more ruthless than they had previously imagined. It completely dismantled their misconceptions about American fragility and fundamentally altered their understanding of what modern combat entailed. While the engagement is historically significant for proving that air superiority could strangle maritime logistics and highlighting the critical role of military intelligence, its legacy is complicated by severe ethical questions. The operation served as a stark demonstration of the moral ambiguities inherent in total war. To this day, the mental image of pilots systematically targeting survivors remains one of the most disturbing and contentious chapters of the Pacific Theater. Ultimately, roughly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors perished in the Bismarck Sea. Their deaths defined not by the glory of combat, but by cold, methodical execution. Those who managed to return home carried with them terrifying accounts of American brutality, spreading a wave of fear that would deeply permeate the psyche of the imperial military for the duration of the conflict. This engagement offered definitive proof that in the modern era, technological dominance equates to total annihilation. The Japanese forces were stunned by their enemy's refusal to grant quarter, realizing that the opposition had transformed into a force far more terrifying than their own propaganda had portrayed. This dark lesson, absorbed through blood and terror over 3 days in March 1943, would dictate the increasingly savage nature of the Pacific War, right up until its atomic conclusion.